You have some folks virtual too.
Because when I transition to talk, I don't have to.
Well, and I guess also too, if anyone's coming from the virtual, if they want to add into, because there will be people virtual.
No,
Yep, there will be people.
But they'll be able to like ask questions and participate. That's why Kimberly's here.
Yeah.
No, I mean, but like a little more.
Oh, yeah.
Oh no. After the first round, just come over there. So I'll just stay here until, and then when it's time, I'll come over there. So nobody else know what we have to do.
Oh, and then you can cross. Oh, I get it. Because you want to cross the like stage. Come on, drama.
So would you ever do that? Would you ever be all the way over there?
Well, I'm thinking we should probably just go on this side because we have to write stuff down on the board, so I don't want to cross.
Yeah, we can stay like this, and then whoever's not talking can bounce.
It looks like this.
If you want me to stand, I think someone would stand here.
Yeah, so I guess you can capture all of us in the same screen at once, right? Yeah, so I think it's fine.
Yeah?
Yeah. If you stay there, I'll kind of tell you the limits. So you're right where if you went any further, you'd be cut off, and you're fine.
Just go right here, so you can just have everything. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then I just took.
My like, my bag.
Yeah. So that way it's not.
Yeah. I just didn't want my like giant purse to break.
I think it's in our room. That room over there. On the table. Yeah. That's good. Okay. I'll check back on you guys.
You know?
So one day, different hair, put your name. She decided. No.
Yeah, no, we still have a couple more minutes.
No, she was on. Yeah, so
My mom's texting her. Almost okay.
she took her hair, washed it. The bathroom
Just ripping her hair. Any oils. She's washing it.
And show when I got in the elevator.
oh, you look like girls, my mom.
She broke free. Oh, that's right. She was really feeling it.
Full on flip.
She's saying, yes, I am ready for fantasy. This is it. Do you see all this?
Do you see all this? You wish you could.
Yes, well. I live for it. Children always surprise me.
So this is my original before, because you know with the sides. I said,
Yeah.
so that trims on the sides.
And she was happy.
Totally. And we got her your side. So she was like,
I gotta show this off.
that's fun. Yes.
It took me forever to get my ears pierced. I had my grandma who would let my parents pierce my ears because back in those days, so it was like I got over it. I love my grandma to death. Like my mom was in Air Force, and I love to stay in my schools with my grandma. So I told my mom, like, that's something that's my niece, one of my little schools, and I'll never forget. So I was crazy about my grandma, so she said no. So I had to be like 22 or something, and I finally wanted to get my ears pierced. And I called to Hot Springs to ask for my mom. Yeah, she's like, boy, you want to do whatever you want to do. Sure.
Okay,
I was like, well, I didn't know.
right? You
I
gotta
thought
tell
you
me.
did right. I thought you didn't want me with pierced ears, so I'm going to go ahead.
My daddy said it goes
Right, so that's a third and third no. There's no if, ands, or buts. And I ran with it for all the years.
That's good.
That's special.
I told you.
Yeah.
That feeling.
You hear what I'm saying?
It takes a long time.
Buy it, bring it, and that thing.
I was supposed to say it.
You can afford it, you not.
And they are expensive.
Right.
I'm a 40 puppy now.
Okay, everyone. Professor in the Department of Prevention and Community Health at George Washington University. And so we are going to talk today about evidence-based engagement to address HIV stigma in faith communities. And so this talk is really going to cover some of the research that we've engaged in or conducted, talk about some of the strategies that we are working with in our research currently to address HIV stigma, and also kind of be some interactive parts. I know you've probably had a lot of people kind of talking to you. And so a portion of this workshop today will also include some opportunities for you all to develop strategies and tools that you can use moving forward. So the agenda is listed there. I never like to read agendas. I feel like we all know the deal. Intros, discussion, activity. But we would like to start with giving you a bit more of an introduction to ourselves and why both of us are so passionate about religion and HIV and spirituality. And so the top picture is a picture of me with my grandmother. I'm the cute baby in the photo. And this is a photo that was taken in my grandmother's office. So my grandmother was a minister, and my grandparents started a church in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's approximately 90 years ago. That church is still fully open and still serves a historically Black low-income community. It's been at that location for almost 40 years now and is seen as an important part of the community and neighborhood there. And it was my experiences growing up in that church, growing up in a family that has a church, that really got me interested in religion and spirituality, and of course the role of churches and faith communities in greater communities at large. And so that's a bit about me and the perspective that I bring to the work that I do.
Thank you. And I'm coming in from the island of Trinidad and Tobago, the picture below. And it's a context where, as you can see, it's quite intact in terms of culturally, people generally know each other. And so if someone is infected with HIV, or it's something that almost everybody in the community might know. And so when you think about stigma, particularly as it relates to how do individuals interact with each other, how do neighbors who are once friends, or who kids once played with each other, right? How does that impact us? And then more broad cultural level, how does religion influence that, right? Since that a lot of the country's sort of history is influenced by the religious structure, how does that impact how we again relate to one another, particularly in a small context where literally you can like hand someone a cup of sugar outside the window. So everyone knows, right? So this is where I come from in terms of seeing how we can take these perspectives, but also apply it into the work that we do today. So we're going to talk about stigma, as many of you sort of have experienced in different roles, right? Thinking about it as not just a issue that is at one time point in the HIV spectrum, but something that actually permeates throughout the entire care cascade. So the care cascade, as many of you already know, is sort of a way or a framework to understand HIV through several cycles. It begins with diagnosis typically and goes all the way. And so we see stigma, again, something that intersects across all points, right, in terms of influencing one's likelihood of going to get HIV tested to be diagnosed on time. That then translates into getting into care on time, receiving appropriate services, staying in care, taking your medications. So it goes through the whole spectrum. And then secondly, we want to think of stigma as a multi-level construct, right? Something that influences an individual in terms of, we often hear internalized stigma. So what does that mean when an individual internalizes and thinks the things in the environment? How does it affect the way they feel about themselves? You can also think about interpersonal stigma, which affects the relationships that individuals might be able to have with their friends, their families, and their social networks. And then finally, at the community level, similarly to what I talked about earlier, how does the dynamic change now when you're living in a part of a community where your access to resources that may be constrained all of a sudden, the people who you are able to go to in terms of getting help are no longer the same. So we're going to have an idea to talk about how stigma permeates across, but also at the multiple levels.
So we wanted to start with a bit of an activity and just to kind of get us all talking and thinking. And so one of the challenges or questions that we pose to you, and we pose this question to ourselves, are what are the biggest challenges to addressing HIV stigma in faith communities? So we know in our work we've met some barriers and we've experienced some challenges in engaging faith communities. And so we wanted to hear from you as we kind of guide our discussion today around what are some of the challenges that you all have faced. And if one or two of you are willing to volunteer, there's no right or wrong answers. We'll write them on the board and then we'll revisit them in the afternoon. So would anyone like to share from their experiences or from even what they've heard?
In my case, the biggest challenge for me when I approach faith communities, they just don't want to hear the topic. Mm-hmm. So they don't know about the topic, but they don't want to hear about the topic. So.
Exactly, and it sounds like even some of that tension between kind of religious communities and religious teachings and HIV, which oftentimes shuts people down and closes people off. Yeah. What are some others? Yes.
So, devilish functions, does that make sense? Or like basically you're in embracing your sexuality or addressing about that you even have a sexuality in itself is you're dirty and or you're perverse per se if you're looking to, I mean, even self-pleasure, that's a total like, we don't touch yourself. You know, from
yeah. So those moral judgments that come, yeah, that's huge.
I often hear people asking the question, is HIV still a thing?
You're fine.
So is HIV even still a problem? A kind of a lack of knowledge around how HIV affects Black communities as a whole. Excellent. So we'll hold on to these three. We'll revisit them. Excellent handwriting. Thank you. We will. That was the challenge.
Person to remember.
That was the challenge because I definitely put my hand down. So we will revisit these during the activity in probably 20 or 30 minutes. So let's start working through those levels that Dr. Ransom shared with us at the start. So starting with the individual, remember that's how we describe the internalized HIV stigma, so feelings of shame or self-worth towards HIV or people living with HIV, as well as individual behaviors. So as background, we know in the United States that religious engagement is particularly important to Black people. And so we have a number of different surveys that say that approximately anywhere from 80 to 90% of African Americans living in the US prescribe to a certain faith tradition, that most of them attend religious services at least once a month, and would say that faith is an important part. Religion, spirituality, faith, these are all important parts of their everyday lives. What we also know is that research to date has overwhelmingly focused on Black churches as being the space in which religion happens. And so part of our work has been to really disentangle religious engagement and to really think about religion as being a multidimensional factor. So something that includes religious engagement, but that also includes spirituality, that includes prayer, that includes private engagement in religious tools and faith and activities. And so the work that we've done and that we'll present is really looking at this question of how and where does spirituality fit into this larger discussion and larger conceptualization of religious engagement. So specifically, we'll present to you two analyses that we conducted using HIV Prevention Trials Network 061 data, or often referred to as the Brothers Connect study. This was a study that was conducted in approximately six cities across the US in 2009 through 2011. It enrolled about 1,500 Black men who have sex with men over the course of that time to complete surveys and to have some interviews. Now, the majority of the sample were 30 years of age and younger, so this was a pretty young group of men. And most of the questions talked about HIV prevention, HIV treatment, substance use, depression, and a number of other factors that we know that affect Black communities. So the examples that we're going to talk about for this individual level are coming from our analyses of these data, and specifically focusing on the questions related to religion and spirituality. So I want to take a little time and walk you through each of these questions. I'm so used to a board, I was carrying a snack in, and I realized, no, that's TV, be careful, don't touch. So we conceptualize religion as having sort of three domains. The first is organizational religious participation, which we often think about as kind of people's reports of going to religious services or reports of being members of a religious institution. The second domain, right in the middle column, is spiritual beliefs. And so these are oftentimes people's beliefs about how meditation and prayer can help them find solutions to their problems, believing in a higher self or God or the divine, and really the ways in which people make purpose and meaning out of events that are happening in their lives. And then the final column is spiritual activities. And these get at the ways in which people engage in those spiritual beliefs. So how often are you praying and meditating? How often do you talk to others, and particularly religious leaders, about your spiritual concerns, about concerns you have in your life? And so these are, again, the questions that were used in that 061 study to better investigate and understand Black men's religion and spirituality. So let's look at the first study. And this study, and I'll kind of go through it let me make sure orange comes up pretty quickly, but in this first study, we focused on internalized HIV stigma as a driver of depression, alcohol use, and CAI stands for condomless anal intercourse, which is a sexual risk factor for HIV. And so what we focused on was looking at how does internalized HIV stigma lead to condomless anal intercourse. And our findings summatively show that men who had increased internalized HIV stigma reported more depression. So they felt sad, they felt a sense of loss. This in turn led to them engaging in more alcohol use, so drinking more alcohol, which then also led to increased condomless anal intercourse. Now, what we wanted to focus on were what are potential solutions. And so the question that we posed was, how does spiritual activities, spiritual beliefs, and religious engagements, like kind of going to church, how does it buffer? Does it buffer? Does it protect men against this kind of the harmful effects that internalized HIV stigma has? And so what we found when we placed these religion and spirituality variables into our model was that spiritual beliefs, spiritual activities, and religious service attendance buffered the association between internalized HIV stigma and depression or depressive symptoms. So what does that mean in kind of plain language? Essentially, men who reported increased internalized HIV stigma, who also reported increased spiritual beliefs, were less likely to report depressive symptoms as compared to those men who reported high internalized HIV stigma, but lower spiritual beliefs. And what's interesting is that when we looked at the effect sizes, when we looked at how protective were these three circles, those three variables there, religious participation, spirituality, we found that the spiritual activities and spiritual beliefs were more protective than religious service attendance. So going to church did not have the same effect as spiritual beliefs and activities did.
And this finding is particularly important to look at stigma, but also the full continuum, as mentioned, right? Not just the risk of having stigma be associated with diagnosis, but what about even incidence, right? And we're defining incidence basically in terms of people coming into the study HIV negative, and by the time the study has ended, have been diagnosed with HIV. So at some point during that phase, right? And so we asked, well, is spirituality and religious attendance or religiosity more broadly, does it also have a protective effect against being seroconverted? And what we find, likewise, in the first part of the study is that spiritual activities does matter, or the spiritual aspects, or at least matter much more than the typical sort of attending church services. And we can see here by the highlight that it reduced the risk or the probability of getting infected during that time period by approximately 35%, right? And so looking at that in the context of the traditional way we have assessed religiosity, such as going to church and the frequency of attending services, it's pointing towards that point again that spirituality matters, and perhaps it may matter to an extent that is even much more powerful as a factor to intervene on compared to looking at people's attendance at church services. So that's sort of the takeaway here in terms of the whole goal of looking at spirituality in addition to religious engagements.
So I know that we focused these two studies on Black men who have sex with men, but we wanted to take a minute to highlight some of the work that we're doing with Black women. And so this is a project that just started. It's in partnership with Ms. Khadija Abdullah, who's the executive director of RACA. It's a community-based organization in Washington, D.C. that works with Black faith communities and faith communities as a whole to address HIV stigma. And so we are using what we've learned from these the previous studies and from other projects to focus on how do we develop intervention tools that increase spirituality, that support Black women living with HIV in increasing their spiritual activities and spiritual beliefs. And so this project uses some of the findings that we saw in those previous studies to develop an online intervention for Black women that would be easily accessible and would increase their spiritual activities and spiritual beliefs in order to support their HIV treatment and care engagement. So we are happy to talk about any of these studies kind of after the fact. We just wanted to kind of highlight that spirituality isn't something that is only centered for Black MSM, but it's something that we see that we can also utilize within Black women as well.
So finally, as we kind of think about what are the potential points to intervention, right? So we started off talking about sort of the historical way that people have approached, or this field has been approached in terms of looking at the role of religion and HIV prevention, whether it's stigma, whether it's diagnosis, and we have said that for the most part, the focus has been on attending services, sort of what does the church function look like. But what we're really finding that we think is quite promising as a takeaway is that spirituality, which is focused on one's own individual journey, a sort of individual experience with a higher power of the divine, that matters. But also one potential strategy is to really focus as a faith leader or those who are connected in faith settings to say, how can we focus more on getting these types of impacts in terms of people's own plans for spirituality? Is that something that we can modify? And we think that's a lot more amendable than, for instance, getting people to attend services more, especially during this pandemic where it is really limited the amount of times or even the capacity for people to congregate. So we think that this is a viable path going forward to kind of focus on one's own relationship with a higher power of divine as a strategy to think about stigma as well as other HIV-related outcomes.
So put a pin in this slide, and now we're going to transition to the next level. Remember, we're talking about 3 levels. Level 2 is interpersonal level, and so this gets into families, peers, social networks, the people that you are around and that you spend time with in your everyday life. So for this example, we're going to talk about an intervention that we conducted in Black churches in North Carolina. This intervention is called Focus on Youth Plus Impact, or Informed Parents and Children Together. So this is an HIV prevention intervention for adolescents between the ages of 11 and 15, and its goals are to increase knowledge about HIV, increase knowledge about HIV stigma and ways in which you can address HIV stigma, and of course prevent HIV prevention and treatment. So this intervention is one of the CDC interventions, and it is, I think now it has been retired, but it had previously been used among adolescent groups in after-school programs, clubs, sports organizations, but it had not been used in faith settings. So our team, along with our community partners at Strengthening the Black Family and the principal investigators of this project at the University of North Carolina, worked with church or faith organizations there to adapt this intervention to a faith setting. That's all I'm going to say about that for now. So the intervention took place in 3 churches, and these were all churches that identified as African American religious institutions, and they either had a health ministry or some kind of youth program ministry. So think of it as like a teen ministry or something along those lines. In terms of our process for adapting, we formed both a youth and adult community advisory board, and this board really worked with every single module within the intervention to ensure that we could actually implement this intervention within the faith settings. We also conducted some focus groups, and we'll highlight some of the findings from that qualitative work as well as some post-intervention surveys. Now, what's interesting to this intervention, we know that we received the intervention. It had modules that focused on HIV prevention, that focused on sexual health and well-being, had modules that included trust and values clarification, and what does goal setting mean for you in your sexual health journeys, had modules related to HIV stigma and sexual identity, and how do we young people identify trusted others with questions that they may have. What we added to this intervention was we worked with faith leaders, and we worked with them through not only the intervention components itself, but in how could they build settings that young people could feel trusted, that their parents could feel that they were receiving trusted information and accurate information, and how to create spaces that are destigmatizing. And so that was the component that we added into the intervention as part of adapting it to this faith setting. So I just want to share 2 quotes that the top quote came from a parent and the bottom quote came from a faith leader who participated in the intervention. And I think these are quite powerful to explaining what it is that we were doing and why we saw the successful intervention as it was implemented. So the top quote says, "I thought the church was a wonderful place to have this intervention. Because they feel safe, it's a familiar surrounding. Other than home, church is like a second home to them, to a lot of them." And so this is referring to adolescents feeling, young people who grew up in the church, who are part of the church, that feel like this is a space at home. And then the bottom quote from a faith leader says, "There's always someone here who can help them understand what's going on with their bodies. And it's eager to learn and eager to have accurate information about HIV prevention and treatment and about HIV stigma, that they had a role to play because they know that parents trust the information that they're receiving, and they know that faith leaders always have kind of an adolescent's well-being in mind, but they also recognize that there was training that they needed as well, that some of their beliefs and activities were actually harmful to that larger mission. And so part of what we had to do when we implemented this intervention was to really focus on how can we customize what we're doing for parents and adolescents to faith leaders as well, so that they can continue to sustain some of the lessons that the parents and adolescents were receiving through the actual intervention.
So now we're going to transition into the sort of final piece of the level where we talked about the rollout in neighborhoods and communities, right? So we focused on the individual aspect as sort of, again, once we went into our journey, we focused on sort of the middle, the interpersonal level, which is the connections among individuals and families. What we find recently is that the role of the community, again, becomes really important in terms of how we address stigma, right? So one of the things that we found in a recent study that came out is that churches appear to be closing, and it appears to be closing in predominantly at higher rates in predominantly Black communities. So we think about earlier again as what stigma does, which is limits one access to resources, both financially in terms of where you can go to get help, but also from a social support or social cohesion aspect, right? So when we think of if individuals are further marginalized, they are sort of cut off from typical resources at the community, whether it's at a school or any other place they can go to. And if these individuals have been going to churches, for instance, to kind of get support, what then happens when those support networks then get removed? So we wanted to approach this aspect from asking the question, what happens? What is the relevance? And in this particular study, it asks, well, is there a relevance not only for HIV, but for health more broadly? And so this is kind of where we see an opportunity, seeing that as something is happening on a bigger level, to be able to use that momentum to figure out how can we take this as a way to address HIV as well. So we see two things as mentioned, right? That first, the social networks matter, right? And again, thinking about who and where do people, right? Where do people go and who do they go to? What happens when those resources are cut off? And then secondly, one of the things that we find is that even within the context of what people are getting at those places are things like food. When you think about food pantries as being one of the key things that churches, for example, provide within communities, a lot of churches also provide spaces for things like daycare or elder care and even sort of counseling. So within the context of HIV stigma being just one of the many challenges that communities face, right? Thinking about bigger aspects, other types of health conditions, what is the overall impact when we think about the opportunities for intervention? So what we've seen so far from this work, again, looking more broadly at HIV as not just a separate condition, but something as part of a larger issue that the Black community in a whole is being challenged with. Two things come to mind based on what we've heard, again, talking either to stakeholders such as clergy members and other faith leaders, but also from the literature. The first is addressing the larger forces that or contribute rather to why churches are closing. So the reasons are myriad. It could be both in terms of people just sort of looking for different ways to engage, right? It could be also things that we're finding residential segregation, resources that are coming into communities. What we're seeing really is that regardless of what that reason is, it affects everyone, right? It affects who's going to get access to services, it affects the types of services that individuals get, and it affects the ability to be able to care for the community at large. And then the second thing is that we're seeing really is the need to really focus on being strategic in the way that sort of faith communities engage with other types of organizations. So traditionally, the work that has looked at the role of churches have been thinking about how churches are connected to other churches. So whether it's within the same denomination or whether it's across denominations, but very rarely have we been able to think about, well, how does the church connect to other institutions that are not sort of from these religious spaces? That may include places like health departments, right? How do we share resources? It includes sort of places like student advocacy offices within campuses, right? And oftentimes universities are looking for ways to engage with faith leaders. And then what are other opportunities, for example, places like libraries or businesses? But the key takeaway point here is that now more than ever, given this new evidence showing that, again, at least some churches are closing in the communities where it matters the most, is that this intentional activity about engaging with stakeholders across the continuum is going to become even more important.
Excellent. So I know we've presented a lot of information to you, but we thought this would be another time to kind of revisit some of the challenges that we thought of and think about how we can apply what we've learned thus far to these challenges. So remember, some of the takeaways that we had were focusing on spirituality and seeing a more multidimensional definition or operationalization of religious engagement, one that includes spiritual beliefs and activities as well as religious service attendance. We also talked about the importance of adapting some of the intervention or HIV prevention and treatment tools that we already have, and what are some of the strategies that we can use to adapt them to faith settings, to engage faith leaders in that adaptation and successfully implement those. And then finally, we've talked about some really important emerging work that talks about the need to continue to build community networks and faith networks to address these larger social determinants of health and these larger structural issues that both perpetuate HIV stigma but other health disparities that exist within communities. So in our final moments, and thank you for hanging with us, we thought we would take a few minutes for you all to do a little bit of thinking, pairing, and then sharing out. And then we will, of course, open up for questions. And so the question that we want to pose to you is that we came out with these 3 challenges. They're listed here, and we'll review them again. And the question that we want to do is perhaps selecting 1 or 2 of these challenges. What are some solutions? What are some next steps that we can take based on some of the evidence that we've presented for you today? Does that make sense yeah? So I think, Dr. Ransom, if you want to read through the 3 again, and then we'll give you all a few minutes to think about them, and then we'll just kind of share out with what we come up with.
So the first one I came up with is that people don't want to hear about some of the topics, right? Whether it's about sexuality, whether it's about HIV. The second is addressing sexuality as perverse or self-pleasure. There's sort of these moral judgments that have typically accompanied discussions. And then the third point that was raised is that people are asking, is HIV still relevant, right? So when we think about all of these as being major topics of prevention, we think about how these might also relate to the levels of HIV stigma in the context of the 3 strategies that we share across the multiple levels. Might be some ways that we can sort of tackle any one of these particular challenges using that 3-level approach. So that's kind of what we want to think about in terms of knowing that focusing on one level may be important, but it may not be sufficient, right? So as we think about multiple ways of addressing stigma, can we sort of come up with a few things that might be relevant? And again, there's no right or wrong issues. These are just sort of, what do you just think of as a gut feeling? What do you kind of see in your own work, or even in your own individual journeys and experiences that might contribute to helping us understand this more?
Maybe we'll give you all a minute. I'll watch the timer and give a countdown. Give you a minute to kind of think, to digest, think about what you've been hearing for the last day and a half, and then we'll do some brainstorming.
And this could be kind of more of a, realize it's not the best setting in a round table, but maybe as one person kind of shares, perhaps another person can build upon that person's comments, and we can kind of have a engaged discussion that way.
Yeah.
We'll give about
I think a minute. Just
okay. Yeah. That is a different color.
Some thoughts early in people's minds. I know, right? That's my problem. But it's not a problem.
Yeah, and I'm trying to bring it full circle from what I've been listening to since yesterday. So my social justice work started with LGBTQ youth homelessness, specifically addressing the lead cause for LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness as a result of familial rejection.
Yes.
And back then, it was just always that responsibility of going to white evangelical pastors who were my former colleagues until I took that stand, and still going to the table and just addressing the family rejection piece. Now, since 2020, losing the organization that I started, because small organization, pandemic, very familiar story, right? So for a lot of us, I'm now in this HIV/AIDS policy work, which I am still new to, and I started a year ago. So it's a lot.
It is a lot.
And so as we partner with the National Black Justice Coalition in our work, and TFAM taking the CDC's Together material and, as we're calling it, faithifying it, I have that responsibility as a white man in the South who is a former Southern Baptist pastor, and that overlap. So I'm thinking of, what is that overlap too of policy?
Yes.
informed in as we were talking in our last session, right? And I heard you very clearly of call it what it is. Southern politics sucks.
Yes. Yes,
Southern
yes.
politics, specifically in a party I used to be a part of, and then I worked for the Democratic Party after losing my organization in 2020, and being asked to come into this space now, Southern Black Policy and Advocacy Network. So the question I'm always wrestling with is, how do I sit down at the table with white evangelical policymakers who don't want to talk about the data, who want to talk about their gross misinterpretation of scripture as the foundation of their policy. And so it is a lot of 1, 2, and 3
Right, all
combined.
together.
And I don't have an answer other than just literally showing up. I know that I can get into a lot of doors with my education, with my background, with how I look. And I know that I only have one shot once I'm in that room. So how do I use that wisely?
Right.
So yeah, no solutions. That's just.
But I think that's an important solution, and one that speaks to, again, this building networks and allyship across the board, because you are able to get into spaces that many of us can't, because you know sort of what they're thinking and what their counter arguments
Right.
is.
Just showing up, like you said, just
Right,
showing
up.
up. Just showing up. Is it words alone?
It is.
I think about Dr. Gaddis when she was speaking to and took us through that exercise of how many of you know your representatives? How many people? How many of them know you? So, and I think that's just that foundation of just show up, continue to show up, be persistent, and recognizing too that not everyone is going to hear you at the table.
Yeah.
One of the things, and I appreciate that too as well, and it gives a good opportunity to kind of help tie some of these things in terms of showing up is important. And one of the things we see in addition to that is kind of knowing what are sort of the key things that organizations care about, right? So what we've been seeing, for example, in terms of the neighborhood sort of like church closing pieces, that when it came down to, there were like 2 bottom lines. They were, what is the impact on financial, whatever it's ties and offerings, etc., to keep buildings together, and then what is the impact in terms of the actual reach that they can have once the pandemic, or I would say the competition rather. So there were 2 kind of big issues that were facing a lot of these sort of churches, right? Not my competition is some online space or some other pastor or a church in a different country perhaps. But then the second thing is that, okay, we need to pay the bills, right? So how do we then use some of these information and say, well, look, here are some ways we could start thinking about it, because it's not just a HIV issue, it's not just but it's an issue that everybody should care about. I think that's sort of the language that a lot of social justice mission has been kind of fortunate enough to start using now. This is not just a blank issue, this is a everything issue. So showing up and having that knowledge of what are some of the things that people are valuing, if you will, really helps to kind of change the way that you are able to respond, and everyone for that matter are able to respond to individuals. So this is really great, yeah.
I think it would also even argue with some of our work in churches in the South is around these incremental steps. And so oftentimes, there would be pushback towards what could be done within the sanctuary and within that space. But then, we could do it under a tent outside. Outside. We could do it at this other adjacent space. And so sometimes that term of meeting people where they are sometimes can feel a little like, I'm not comfortable with that, but sometimes that's where we have to start. And then once we get in and we get those conversations going, we can start to have a more expansive and inclusive discussion and dialogue about what actually needs to change. But so for example, with the focus on youth intervention, we know CDC loves their condom demonstrations. They're always a part of a lot of those interventions, and we had to come up with some creative ways to do that because faith leaders were saying we're not going to have you put a condom on a banana in a church, full stop. So we had to come up with some creative ways to do that. We had to move that element to another session, but we were still able to have these other so very important and much needed intervention tools shared with parents and youth. And so sometimes it's about what are some of the things that we can incrementally bring in and then slowly bring in the rest? What are some other thoughts? Yes.
So, I was a youth director, so I'm Buddhist, and as a space of that, while Buddhism is very open and compelling and things of that nature, just like with any other sect of faith, right? Religion is a space of, here's the box that you need to fit in behaviorally speaking, do you know what I mean? Like a good XYZ fill in blank. So I'm that kind of radical person, so me as a youth director during that particular time period, so it was about a good 13, 15 year spans, you know, and so I got to really all over Texas, but my point is a space of that we couldn't do this. Does that make sense? Like, our religious faith leaders were like, no, not really, but I learned to establish a rapport with some of the, like you were saying, faith leaders and the respective women as well as men, males, and then addressing their life traumas. So then later on in our one-on-one dialogues, either they would send the individual to me, but we would address about wearing a condom, prevention, blah, 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 this, that, and the other. So having those dialogues, I feel like as they were sharing and training those people, I became more of like, okay, if you have a situation that's, you don't really talk to your parents, so I'm talking to this, so we had like, you know, a girls sleepover, and in our girls sleepover, right?
Right.
We talked about vibrators, pleasuring yourself. This is how you put on a condom. Like, I'm very forthright and very blunt, you know, just this is how you be able to do this. And so the parents were like, oh, whatever you guys talk about during your girls' time, that'll be great, and blah, 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 blah. And so then they just kind of took it like that. But they were, like you said, confident about, I'm not going to steer them wrong in regards to not being able to protect themselves, not be able to this, that, and the other. And so, like yourself, even though a lot of doors, I mean, and the sex of Buddhism that I am, it is very, very diverse, but it would be Japanese home, an Indian home, this, that, and the other. And so, you know, I can't change what I look like as a large black woman, you know, and coming in with dreadlocks, you're like, so what are we gonna talk about? How can I trust you? But building a rapport with those parents left me better into a space of getting in the door, so then those children felt compelled to use, I can still be Buddhist, I can still have my center of spirituality, and it's not deterring or it's not taking away from me as a whole person. And so sharing that with their friends, does that make sense? So educating them, help them to educate their friends, because of areas like, even if I don't know the answer, I do know X, Y, Z in person that I can take you to get said education or guidance, and you can trust what they're saying.
Building those peer networks.
Right.
And now that's really how we talk about changing culture and shifting norms. It's with these little networks of educated and knowing how to find correct information and share that information and share resources. That's really how we start to see so much of that change.
I had to start getting girl time, tea time,
the slumber party time.
You know, because like you were like Dr. Ganesh was pointing out, like it was real. We had 12-year-olds having a baby because they got raped and blah 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 and this, that, and the other, and you're still supposed to be okay and love their brother. And I'm like, you know, I'm having my uncle's baby. Like who does that? How is that? Like, where did I fall in, and how do I protect myself? So even if I am in said situation, it's okay to take a plan B.
Right.
I'm okay within my rights to go to a faith leader and be like, this is what has occurred. I need help. How do I, and how do I better prevent and protect myself? So yeah, I felt very blessed and to be able to help to do that. And so I've since then now other leaders, and so now it's like they have a thing, and so they do once a week of a girls like outside of the church. Outside we have tea time or girl time, and so that I feel like that has definitely helped them to be able to circumvent some of that policy and some of because the red tape is still there. I mean, like our LGBT community group is not really so much supported, like she was saying, is definitely not on the budget.
Right.
Barely like getting a time frame of like a room at the church, like to be recognized or anything. We're just now coming to space to allow a he, they, she, and her in a group, you know what I mean, welcoming. So even in Buddhism, I totally get.
Thank you so much, thank you. In the back.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I'm staff, so one way we can honor the workshop leaders here specifically and their great work, but all the other rooms is continue to do the evals, which I know we're like preaching at it, but like the data does help, and it really does help to continue to show that this work is relevant and important. So thanks for all that you're doing. I don't have access to your data sets and all that, so I was just curious, like, how do you read that and the difference between church attendance? You're saying it doesn't really make sense to kind of direct people, funnel them back to church spaces as a way of interrupting some of those spirals, drug use and such, whatever. Yeah. But I'm also wondering, is that also coded as like religious versus spiritual in the way that the person is taking, like the participants, how are they reading that? Or is it actually evaluating something like the evolutionary psychologist might go, well, what you're actually tracking is the sort of passive participant versus the active dynamic person who's internalizing and making their own. So could you kind of share with us a little bit about how you're interpreting that?
I'm going to go back to the question.
Yeah. So there's kind of we can start off two ways, right? So what you're kind of talking about is sort of the way that has been operationalized, right? In this particular survey, right? Typically what happens is that the respondent will get the first question or a series of sort of first questions, and that typically looks like, are you affiliated with any sort of religious or are you affiliated with traditions? And that might include whether it's Baptist, whether it's Protestant, Pentecost, etc. So that person has a chance to fill those out, but then there might be a space to say no, right, or not affiliated. Then that person might go to a second question as well. How often do you attend religious services, right? So that person who clicked a no, chances are, right, they are not going to fill out that second question, right? But sometimes people, they still do, even though they don't identify per se with a tradition, they may still go to church. So that person is then recorded in that question of, well, once a year, once a month, or once a week, etc. And then from that subset, typically the questions will progress to a second set of questions, which is then the actual spiritual belief. So what is important to note is that one need not be or define themselves as religious or attending to complete these questions, right? And so that's one of the beautiful things about this is that we are not restricting an individual to define themselves as religious in order to qualify to have a spiritual experience. So this is kind of one of the ways that anyone can identify and record these questions, right? So it's not so much a matter of separating out people. That's not the real intention. Although some surveys do that, but this particular way that is assessed, anyone can have this spiritual experience, right? So, and this would be kind of looked at as a stack and not necessarily stratified. But that is
right. So could you say I'm religious and I do meditative prayer?
So
and
I think that's
does that look different from someone who says no, but I do meditative prayer? Are those sets different?
Yes and no. So I think one, to the response options, it's strongly agree to strongly disagree, and then the frequency is getting up this kind of once a year, once a month, once a week type of thing. However, we do have some work that uses a type of analysis that allows us to look at how people group themselves together. And so some of that analyses just show that there are some differences in terms of people going to church services, just to use the language that's here, going to religious institutions, and those that may be more engaged in kind of prayer and meditation, and that those groups, different categories of people respond differently. In this case, this was looking at sexual initiation among people under the age of 17 years, but that they have different outcomes. But that's definitely a question that we are thinking about and going to anything to that larger point of as people are defining religious engagement in different ways. How do we work with faith leaders to understand that even if they're not physically present within your church space, what does it mean to support people's spiritual growth and spirituality and spiritual beliefs and activities that we're seeing has these protective effects, perhaps even more so than when people are in the physical space.
I would like to know if, I don't know if you looked at this at your research, attending church versus wanting to attend church. And I'm thinking, I'm a Latina, right? So I'm just thinking people that they want to attend church, but I'm not accepted there. So spirituality becomes settling. But it's not what I want. I want my religious group to accept me.
That's a great question. Thank you. I have not, now I'm like running through all the things. I know that has come up qualitatively, especially in that faith and ART, the Black women living with HIV study. I know that's come up qualitatively around, not being able to be within a church setting and now relying on these other tools once diagnosed with HIV, like meditation and prayer, looking for another type of church home. It's a very small anecdotal, but I think that's a really important question.
And these are the things that we hope to sort of flesh out by having this discussion, right? That the traditional way that we've often talked about churches, that either you're there or you're not. Right. You're going every week or you're not, right? You're missing, but what about those sort of subjective ways or the psychological sort of questions that people may pose? And so this gives us a chance now to, when these questions and these new surveys are coming up, we can say, look, we can't just take this for a given, right? It's not just yes or no, but we need to kind of step back a little bit and assess what might be some things that we are missing. Perhaps, like I said, people wanting to attend, but maybe not. So these all help us sort of recycle and take this information, go back in to say, well, we need to be thinking about these things much more critically. As mentioned, this survey was assessed, was in 2009 to 2011. Yeah. And again, a lot of assumptions. Nobody knew that potentially churches might not exist, at least as much. So now that we have, or we've seen these things, we can go back when these surveys are created, when new studies are coming online, how can we ask the questions now to kind of start thinking about what is actually happening now in this context. So thank you for sharing that too as well.
I do want to be mindful of the time. I know there is a lot more for us to do. It's about 5:04. This is our contact information. Please, you are part of our research family and activist family. Send us an email, reach out to us. We would love to continue this discussion. If there are other questions, we will obviously be around and we'll be here. But thank you all so much for a wonderful workshop and activity and engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. Thank you everyone for attending. I'm Kimberly, one of the staff too.
Please complete your evaluations.
Please.
That's helpful for us and helpful for the conference.
Where are the evaluations?
So they're
we have also these beautiful banners outside that have the QR code on it where you can just take your cell phone and scan it. So literally right by registration, you'll see several banners that are placed up like that. And it's also online as well on the website. So
just go to the QR code. Each one is individually.
Yes.
You just take a picture of, you put your camera on and then just it'll scan it for you and it'll bring up your website. It's a Qualtrics survey. So literally any of the banners out there, you'll see the little survey.
So then when you get the agenda.
Right.
That's I figured that's where you were going. When you get the agenda, look for 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock.
Dr. Tamara Taggart, I think.
It'll be this workshop. You can be able to about it.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much.
That was like,
thank you. It's great to
I know. You're electronic this time, y'all. You're kind of tough to keep up with the papers nowadays.
Southern focus.
Thank you so much,
Texas,
everyone.
Florida, and Georgia are our primary focus. So,
No, you're just kind of sleep off and start off with the hardest.
Those are our 3 EHC jurisdictions.
Yeah.
The 16 LGBT jurisdictions.
Yes.
But we're, our CEO and founder is from Dallas as well. So it started there and now it's.
So you're focusing on more like policy issues, like you said,
policy matters.
And it's around what are some of the specific points that you are?
So our funding has been around and specifically how do you take the community voice and that with your policymakers in Texas, Florida, and Georgia.
So I need you to tell us next year. I want to come to your presentation on how that's done.
Lord. Well, when I think back to my my work with an organization that was called Outlast Youth that I founded, and with LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness, that was we were just Dallas focused.
Right.
And then it was Dallas County. And then it became the entire Metroplex. And then it was statewide because of legislation.
And it was, and we were just starting to look at what does growth outside of Texas look like too now, specifically tapping into the faith-based advocacy work, and what I was teaching at conferences as well.
That's because I know some folks, colleagues who do work around youth homelessness in Baltimore and in LA or Los Angeles County.
Yeah.
I'm so confused, but I don't know that they tap into religious communities or faith communities in those spaces. I mean, it's not my area of focus, but it just isn't running through what they're doing. I don't think
it was very prominent in both white evangelical and black evangelical churches in the Bible Belt.
Right.
And there was that overlap, but there was just also a disconnect that I had to. Finally, I had a.
Thank you so much.
Like pastor friend.
They'll come to.
Oh, okay. And then I don't
I'm just gonna get old money on fire.
Right.
I think it's
okay. Some like wacky video. Like, all right, I will behave as
So you said it's like something
Super boy, and he's like looking at it's like that. Research on the women in DC.
So that just started. We are in the qualitative phase of it, so it should be my intentions. Our intentions will be to have it completed probably by December. Yeah, so it's a shorter, it's a smaller pilot. Our goal is to get some preliminary evidence to apply for a larger NIH grant. But it's really great. Khadija Abdullah, community partner, she did a similar setup around female genital mutilation cutting. And so working in DC, but now that has a national, but started as a small pilot and developing this kind of online intervention, and so we found that it was something we're
and going
to work around spirituality, and she has similar work with Black women as well, and I have some other work on Black women with
So
it's not us going here.
Because you wouldn't have relationships to kind of
that they can access on their own as they need, as they're navigating. So it's been really exciting. It's great to hear. It's also, you think of DC as being
because they are probably
it's an accepting
I guess they
are
right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Sure.
Like you only have this time, you know.
You would.
But it is
grassroots. Just community. I had to do this. I had to do that. And so much of it is tied to trauma and abuse and substance abuse. So much.
Especially when you
yes, and poverty and like structural racism and lack of resources, access to care.
So this is something that you said, like basically from here on out, going from these different the 4 states that you're working through.
We talk about this.
What does that look like? What do you guys have like set for like by 2023? Like what are some things that you all feel like is reasonable success?
Change works and work on all these macro level factors.
I was thinking, like, I wonder whether or not we have like a few evidence that says literature is actually more preventative of. Then I was thinking, like, what does that tell us about
gender difference, right?
Right, and then I'm thinking, so like, is that plausible with the alpha? How does those support this?
I don't know. I mean, I'll be honest,
No,
I don't know.
right, and your is just I guess, but yeah, it's.
I don't know. That's a great question. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I don't.
Yes, it look like
Just trying to like.
But no, I'm saying it's how it works, and sometimes you have to kind of say, well, look, success might not be as
I mean, we know
big change,
that
but like we're trending towards something because this work is hard. You always need that.
Engagement is
high, so you have
and then it
personal
drops a little,
drive,
and then it
sure.
comes back
That goes a
up.
long way, but also
But what's happening kind of specifically to just yes, it is. It's definitely higher for women than men.
He's on some
right. I mean, that's like, and how does that change now that we know that we
do want his
congregations that are more accepting? Now there's these cases happening. Now that we've been talking about this kind of virtual church that's now and attend services like I always I still was attending a church in DC which was close. And now I still do services back home, my home church. Like, and then I sometimes tap into a church I went to when I was a grad student in North Carolina, and like, and I go into like my wishes. I'm just like, really.
That's super full. That's like more than a full time.
Oh, yeah.
It is
That's
still
like literally
very high.
You get up to my
You know, now
admin,
it's
find some time on the calendar.
Exactly.
There's just a lot of really
So,
great
and
questions
why
around that, and that's why I
what
kind of
are-
say like that
what are
focus
the
on
other
that
positions
independence so
in
much to like what are
the next 6
people
months?
So that we
getting internally, they're doing, you know, Monday to Saturday, and how
decide
far
as
that is part of the larger, like,
Yeah, no, so we appreciate that too, because I said like.
No, that's so great.
It's
Thank you for
exciting.
doing it.
No,
Yeah, I
thank
mean, like,
you.
We appreciate
This is awesome.
advocacy because we know that, like, so the worlds are always like when we do
Yeah.
something this
I
size.
mean, it's just been amazing, great.
It's a powerful thing.
So,
And I was thinking, like, with
that's
your
the
work,
important stuff
it's,
that you
you're
should
trying to
hope to that
implement
is.
this.
Yes, yeah.
I think like from the
sort of
point
the stuff
like
that
it's
you
exactly
think
for
of.
Right.
It's small innovations.
Right.
And the all day work and
Right.
it's like we can
Little
like,
micro
exactly.
steps,
And
as
then
long
the
as we're moving
it's
towards,
like,
yeah.
what's a
Burn it down.
Exactly.
Burn
It's
the
like
whole thing
the
down.
About the personalities,
Yeah,
perspectives, methods,
I'm always like, I'm in the middle, I'm like, burn it
I have
down.
been 30 minutes.
Right.
That's our data behind it. We're still burning it down, but we're just like.
marshmallows if they're gonna burn something.
Right. Let's do, but yes, effectively burn. Like, we'll fire it along way. It's so nice to
Yeah,
chat
so,
with
yeah,
you.
yeah,
Thank
absolutely,
you.
absolutely. Oh my gosh, yeah.
Or we can go back to these stats and figures.
I will. Yeah, I know.
But I gotta run because I think.
Oh, no, I'm sure, yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
This
so
was
much. So
wonderful.
nice to
Thank
meet
you, thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you.
So no, but yeah, keep pushing that work. Like I said, the things that change.
Okay.
So
So, I'm
things
sorry.
that change.
No, sorry.
Working and doing that at the same time. I wanted to
What
ask
steps
you
are
this,
stuff that you never
so
say yes to making that difference.
I have a master's degree in public health.
Oh, excellent.
I've never been able to really use
I will, like,
it
with your
per
context
se as far
picture.
as like the work, but I do know that I would like to get a doctorate in like medical. So I teach pharmaceuticals.
Okay,
And
yeah.
so as a space of understanding public health and its relation to the ramifications of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
Says socioeconomics, but also in regards to the HIV and its prevalency. You know, I see the ending rates, the end
Yeah.
results of like
Yeah.
the lack of prevention and loss of communication. So I wanted to ask, like, how does one move forward in as far as education to be able to speak on that, or how did you get involved on doing that? I guess so I undergrads in biochem, and so then I have this master's degree in PhD because I do want to do this work.
Yeah.
But you know, I live in pharmaceuticals, so I'm trying to tie it
Piece
all
it all
together.
together.
You know what I
No, I
mean?
got you.
And so
Yeah.
it's a space of like, but as I was expressing, I am Buddhist, and it's not really something that is addressed. So similar to the Christian community,
Yeah.
and the same way as a space of we would rather not touch on that.
Right.
So how do you tie all that together? I mean, like, why would you? Because I see that you guys have both done this in regards to your respective faiths. So how did you work on moving through that motion? Is it education or is it like a path?
I think it's a path. I mean, I think that strategically this is a portion of our work, but we, you know, have a lot of pots, if you will.
Okay.
And so part of that strategy to have the kind of freedom to engage in this work is that I also have some pots that are, I hate to say sexier, but pots that are, you know, that are
More
prep
fun.
and that are neighborhoods and that are structural racism and that are really kind of hot sort of things. And so that then allows for me to have the time to also do this work, which is also hot and the things that I'm passionate about.
Right.
But sometimes, you know, you gotta split the pot.
For sure.
I think in terms of kind of how do I reconcile this, you know, it's interesting. My mom's a nurse, my dad was a scientist, and as I said, my family's had a church now for some time in Ohio, and so I've always been raised in this like conservative space,
Right.
But with a conservative space of like you mind your business and help others.
That part.
And so like that, you know, I don't know, that's not like an education thing. That was just how it was like, yeah, no, we're conservative, right? We're religious people in the Midwest.
Right.
So that is the underline, but at the same time, mind your business, help and serve other people.
Yeah.
Like God doesn't need your assistance in judging.
Right.
And, and so I think that was kind of what was always instilled in me and what I saw, and particularly like the neighborhood that my church was in was so different from the neighborhood that I grew up in or where I went to school in or where my friends. And so, it was very much ingrained upon me that like, yes, there are differences, but for the grace of God, you're right here as well. And this is how we serve our communities as a whole. And so I think that's part of what I use to kind of just help ground me into the work that I'm doing. And I think in terms of moving forward, I say it's never too late. I will share, I was 7 years out of my undergrad before I went to my PhD program. I worked full time during my master's program. I only got it because I could walk across the street and go to school. I always chuckle. We went to his doctoral program, the same place where I went to a master's program. I was like, we won't talk about how many classes I missed because I was working. So you probably wouldn't have known me. Because sometimes I went to school, sometimes I went to work. But that was sort of, I think people are taking these different paths, and there's programs that are more, so even a program for my PhD program, I was, despite that 7-year gap, I was among one of the younger people in my cohort, probably in the middle. I think people were in their late 20s to late 30s in my cohort. And so there are different programs that have these kind of more part-time programs. I know there's some DRPH programs that are part-time, that PhD, I don't know of any part-time PhD programs, but I certainly know of programs that cater to more people coming in with greater work experience, as well as those master's degrees. And so sometimes it's just about finding a program that is going to be a really good fit for you.
Did you get certifications like behavior? Because I got my master's degree in public health. So did you get those certifications? So I went to a school and based out of Chicago, but they didn't say anything about this specializing in regards to behavioral
like
or
the
financial and blah, 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 blah. So I never got any certificate in regards to any of that.
Yeah,
so
I think,
you didn't
I think that's kind of a newer thing.
Yeah, I feel like people who typically want to go into consulting, so they can have those certifications, but like it wasn't necessary as part of what you needed to be.
To get into a doctorate.
No, you just need the band PH and that's it. I think also like just now being on the other side of MPH program development, it's a money thing too. You charge a little more for a certificate.
Yeah.
Like in terms of students, so like I know we're pushing out some things and it's like that gets you a little more money
for sure.
In the tuition dollar. I don't think it has. Well, that's all.
Yeah.
I don't think it has anything really to do with.
Gotcha.
Like
that is impactful on getting hired or
kind of learning the same stuff. New course member, same stuff.
So is your research? So you're more on the research end of things, like not being funny. So I'm a single parent with a 5-year-old. Is this viably? I want to do the work, but I'm also like, I need to afford things for my child. You know what I mean? And so I'm like, is this?
That's for some of the part-time, like I know with GW's DRPH program, a lot of them are working, a lot of those cohorts are working and their jobs are supporting a portion of their educational costs. And so the program is set up where they can kind of go through the program while also still working full-time. So I know of 2 students that I at least am aware of, and I know that's not an exception because the programs are so expensive. I think I can speak of George Washington, a lot of that programming is also moved online to support kind of distance learning and people who are, have some different, and have multiple responsibilities. And so coming to school all day on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is almost kind of that's not really what's expected anymore. And now it's kind of looking at, okay, you all are here on Monday and Tuesday, and maybe you're online on Wednesday or something like that. So, I mean, is it challenging? For sure. I think
so I guess, yes, I have 2 daughters and I did my program. When I started, my first daughter was when she was on 10, but she was, kind of still a babyish when I was there. And one of the things that I always think is that when you get into the program, like it goes by really fast, like to be honest. Like, even though you may kind of start off on a slow point, one of the things that I've always really been thankful for as I look back is that I could have sort of stopped and really just sort of, said I'm going to do this, but when I looked at how fast I was able to finish, and that when I got out, she was still at an age that I could still build that relationship and stuff, right? I really just, I felt glad that I didn't necessarily
wait until she was like,
because it's just like, I've seen that, and it's like you feel like you can wait, but life, as we know, life doesn't stop, right? And so it just really is something that I would always share with somebody, like it's gonna go by as fast as we kind of think it is, and that's the first. And the second thing is that if you're kind of open in terms of going to different places, like the programs provide funding. Most of the PhD programs that we apply to, like I got funded for 4 years. First was a 2-year mechanism. Then when that 2 years was up, I got into a training program. So I ended up actually providing some, a little less than you probably typically might make working independently, but it provided funds, right? So I would say I wouldn't, I would kind of spend some time looking at the programs that do give that 4 years of funding. Because that's going to be a way to not have that financial burden on you as well. I think that's typically what people have always found as a deterrent, a money thing. But
that's really been like my.
But you can get the funding. I was 6 years fully funded. My program. I'm slow. No, I'm not slow. We were in different programs. It's Carolina is a 5 or 6 year thing, but you can get 4 years, you can get 6 years. I will always say, I think, there are multiple ways to get around it. As I said, employers, and I will say, like, especially coming in with, you already have the experience, like if you're thinking about scholarships through schools and such, a lot of times they prioritize students that are coming back because it's very easy to get the RA ship for you that, armed with that RA ship, they're going to pay a portion of tuition. So for example, we have some packages that pay a portion of tuition, but then you have a larger RA stipend. The student that's coming in that's already, worked for many years, has a skill set, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, sometimes can be a bit more attractive than someone who's ED. This thing is off, correct, sir?
Yes.
Oh, this is off, yeah? No, it's still going?
Still streaming live.
Still streaming? Really?
Oh, really?
We've had
a full-on good night.
conversation.
A full-on conversation.
Should we stop it?
Yeah, because I'm